Hello everyone, today we talk about the Pergamon army organization. Pergamon, as you know, being one of the Diadochi states, one of the lesser ones that was born in fact out of, as we'll see now, not really an usurpation, but fundamentally the ability to carve out this dominion that never reached the same extent of others. We will see it in fact from the same organization of the armed forces, right? The Pergamon army, for example, never deployed, as far as we know, an Hellenistic Macedonian phalanx, right? That required much more extensive resources that fundamentally just the Seleucids, the Antigonids, and the Ptolemies actually got. It's not like Hellenism, as we've explained a lot of times in other videos, doesn't quite correspond in warfare to the to a tactical model, right? But to a tactical theory and interaction of the various arms, and essentially with all what you have available. Of course, Pergamon, just as the other properly Diadochi powers, because there were many other Hellenistic powers in which you can put into account even Pontus or Carthage or even Rome, if you really isolate certain single aspects of Roman warfare, at least in its broader, that we say they were Hellenistic essentially because they had been pioneered previously by the Hellenistic powers in the Mediterranean, and then essentially imitated by the Romans, but as a natural development of their armed forces and military practice. And Pergamon stands as a smaller power among giants that naturally also had their own crises and difficulties. They fill this gap of northwestern Anatolia, fundamentally, that was actually very very important from a strategic point of view. The same Ptolemies, for example, had possessions that stretch from the south of Anatolia to up to even the same Balkans. The same naturally Antigonid expansion towards the east compared to Seleucids come de facto to threaten the same Pergamon. So there was a lot of things going on, right? We will observe this in other videos, especially about battles and other events of Hellenistic and Roman warfare. And in one of, by the way, of the richest and most urbanized areas of the ancient world, that also during the Roman Empire, what was essentially the Pergamon power that was absorbed in 133 BC by the Romans, became the province of Asia, right? And that was, together with Italy, southern Gaul, southern Spain, and North Africa, one of the most intensely urbanized and advanced areas of the whole ancient world. And this these powers were also continuously struggling with other neighboring forces. Think about the Bithynians or even the Galatians, right, that the Pergamans fought against. And we've got to admit that in spite of some, swinging, oscillating fortunes, Pergamon managed to maintain its own independence up to, in fact, the late 2nd century BC, when Attalus III bequeathed his kingdom to Rome. It was actually an extortion, as basically all of Roman or any other powers acquisitions, for that matter, at the time. So let's simply observe it, and pointing out that we know fairly a few, after all, about these realities. This is a problem with Hellenistic warfare in general. It's paradoxical, but once you're, let's say, better acquainted maybe with the historiography, we know, you understand that we know much less about Hellenistic warfare than we do of, for example, classical Hellenic warfare, right? Simply the sources are different. These are not city-states with citizens that have right or free. These are properly tyrannies, if you want, or better, imperial dynasties of some extent. In the case of Pergamon, maybe not so much, but the model originally set by the Macedonians and Alexanders is what properly lived on with this. So there was not much of a middle class to tell us the story of the thing. We know dramatically a few, after all, about the same organizations of even larger powers, such as the Seleucids, that we made already a substantial amount of videos on. I think we never made a video on the Ptolemies. We talked about the Antigonids, but in general, these are chapters in military history that we know dramatically a few of. Right, and we're very lucky even to know slightly something more about the Romans, but don't think, as we often said also in the Roman warfare videos, that we know this much about this world. Very often we go by analogy. Sometimes we lack even just, the iconography of this. This may seem banal at some point. We know that iconography is not the truth of what is actually displayed. There is a lot of beautiful Pergamon's reliefs from the altar of Pergamon that are, representative of a broader Hellenistic armament of the time, but punctually in detail, we know very few about the whole thing. So, as we were saying before, the kingdom of Pergamon grew out of essentially the treasure chest of Lysimachus, that also had established this power across the Balkans and Anatolia, that eventually would mostly stick, in fact, to the Thracian side of the geographical isle. And Lysimachus had entrusted 9,000 talents to Philetairos, right? That was, in fact, the governor of the Greek city of Pergamon in Mysia, right? This is important because, properly, all the Hellenistic powers had, let's say the Diadochi better, had fundamentally not much of an idea of capital properly meant. I mean, of course, there were cities that were more important than others. Think about the Seleucids, with Seleucia actually saying given in name of Seleucus the First. Eventually, they shifted the capital to Antioch. The Ptolemies had actually, and naturally, Alexandria, and the Macedonians Pella, but it's not that their military power was properly centered in these cities. As a matter of fact, exactly because their territories were so extended, they could have these military settlements scattered along their empires that were a bit like both a garrison or a military colony, right? A bit similar to what also the Romans will do at some point. And they could draw the army from the whole thing. Like cities were properly naturally rich and important. They had their own military organization, their militias essentially. They hadn't much of professional forces, but they weren't properly the center of power itself. With Pergamon instead, it's kind of a hybrid fundamentally, and because Pergamon was not a monocity power of the Hellenistic times, as you could think of, I don't know, of Rhodes or of Athens or Sparta or other centers. They're in fact more properly polis, right? But still was centered about this huge city. In fact, became one of the great capital of Hellenism, and that remained central even for the recruitment of the troops in many ways. Philetairos eventually went over to Seleucus I, and never claimed independence openly, but kept the money that he had received and building the basis of the power for his heirs. And his successor was Eumenes I, that did assume independence, right? And thereafter, the Pergamon kings fought sporadically, essentially, with the Seleucid kings, Seleucid usurpers, and the Galatians, until the Battle of Magnesia, where that we haven't made a video on the Battle of Magnesia yet. It's one of my favorite battles in absolute terms, very fascinating, and we talked about it though in the Seleucid military history videos. And that the Pergamon cavalry on that occasion, that light cavalry skirmishers mostly, managed to put in disarray the Seleucid Scythid chariots, and that eventually overrun they routed against their own right wing, and that was a major blow for the Seleucids during the battle. So they had this, in that case, for example, an auxiliary role for the Romans. And after the peace of 189 BC, Pergamon was given the Seleucid territory west of the Taurus, right? And this was, so basically all that remained, namely of the Anatolian territories of the Seleucid Empire by that time, that, as we've seen, were actually very advanced. And the Seleucids had managed to carve also from the Ptolemies at some point. I mean, as you know, the Seleucids never recovered from that defeat, right? Eventually the empire crumbled within itself. There were internal strifes, etc. And the same Pergamon, after all, was just a Roman client's tale by that time. And as we have seen in 133 BC, Attalus III bequeathed his kingdom to Rome and became the province of Asia, where the Romans did, all the worst imaginable in terms of local exploitation, corruption, abuses, all that. There is an enormous chapter of Roman history. It's extremely fascinating. The area was pretty damn rich, right? At this point, the Romans were managing in a very private fashion, internally to their own political games, this subcontracts of the various provinces, etc. So, and it was actually a troubled area, because eventually, think about the Mithridatic Wars, all the Roman citizens being massacred, and there did the world wars ensuing. But at that time, Pergamon never kind of recovered in any way, and as many other Hellenistic powers, fundamentally was simply absorbed by Rome and remaining with all their autonomies in a way, as you know, that the Roman Empire was content as long as everybody was subdued. They didn't do anything to disrupt trade and order and paying taxes. That was paying the tolls and so on. So, however, till 189 BC, Pergamon controlled effectively no military settlements. Right, this is important. It was basically a cluster of cities dominated by Pergamon, and had no large Hellenic-Macedonian population to provide a native regular army like the other Diadochi instead could, right? These settlers were originally the veterans of Alexander's armies, and that settled down in the various regions of the empire, and remained involved in the game. As we have seen, the same dynamic that brought to the construction of Pergamon didn't include that. Eventually, in the Diadochi kingdoms or empires, whatever you want to call them, because we're actually even differently named, were at least the Seleucids were an empire. The Ptolemies and the Macedonians were a kingdom. But this is maybe not so important. But there was other movements of Hellenic Macedonian settlers of this kind. Here in Pergamon, there was properly none of that. There was a citizen militia in Pergamon itself, as this bulky city as we've seen. But though this served in distant garrisons as well as defending the walls of the city, right, in case of necessity, it does not seem to have been relied on for battle. And this is naturally very important, because it makes you understand that along with city militias, the rest of city militias, probably there was an attempt by the side of the Italics to transform these troops into something slightly more professional. I mean, if I send the city militia to garrison another city, if anything, I have to pay them to be there. So this system doesn't work very well if you have literally to take away citizens from their city where they have their crafts, the stuff, and there wasn't probably even any money for doing that. And preferably they would have hired some other troops. So this was a great deal. We don't know, as a matter of fact, even as the militia was equipped, because we generally don't know it for the ancient world in relative terms. We could imagine them to be essentially all kind of types of troops. Actually, if you look at other polis armies, you find that they were segmented with every kind of arm. Right, skirmishers, light and heavy infantry, light and heavy cavalry, and siege engines. That actually Pergamon, as one of the most advanced, technologically advanced cities of the ancient world, could deploy, and we'll see it later, because the Romans also basically seized them when they they entered in possession of the city. And we can imagine, though, however, to have been like maybe an elite of hoplites and well-equipped cavalry, and the rest being just mostly light infantry. As for the citizenry proper, but it is obvious that the bulk of the forces actually were mercenaries of the usual mixed Hellenic and non-Hellenic origins, right? You know that Anatolia is extremely ethnically diverse in many ways, and of course these were fundamentally Hellenic or Hellenized communities, especially along the Aegean coast. But there was this extremely effervescent choice of troops coming from everywhere. Think about Anatolia having, I don't know, this influence is literally from every area, from every even military culture. After all, the Gauls had settled there. Was this Hellenic area? Was the ancient Persian influence? There were even Scythians to be found actually coming from the Caucasus as mercenaries, etc. There was these other native populations living in the mountains in Lycia, on the Taurus, and there were even Thracians. As a matter of fact, the Bithynians fundamentally were mostly Thraco-Hellenic at this point. So you can imagine how many troops could be found, and it was definitely much more convenient for this very large and powerful city-state to hire mercenaries whenever was necessary, and then disband them when they didn't need them anymore, which is essentially what all the other city powers fundamentally behaved like. There was at this point great monetization of warfare in the first place. The political organization of the Hellenic world had by far entered, in crisis relative to the dichotomy of the, citizen, let's say, we can say even soldier, but probably, the hoplite that just works the land or has its own craft and then goes to war. This thing is far surpassed, at least since the 5th century. And therefore, instead, the area is plenty of this other kind of barbarian, semi-barbarian troops. Just they're poor. Normally, they live in the hinterland. They live in a kind of semi-militarized state. This is because of their continuous warfare, raiders, as looters and so on. So therefore, they can't be hired to make a living in this more powerful. This richer centers fundamentally. And as far as we were saying before, actually, even these mercenaries do not seem to have formed any Hellenistic phalanx of pikemen. Surely there were phalanxes in the Hoplitic sense, right? Of course, the average, as we've seen before, heavy trooper could be equipped with the Hoplite and so on, but about this we have to tell that even that kind of warfare was fundamentally declining. Actually, we're not sure by which extent, right? We're somewhat more informed on the origins of hoplitic warfare than its end, but here we are in full Hellenistic times, and that model, at least from a merely tactical point of view, has been by far surpassed. So we have also seen in other videos how being equipped with an Hoplite, with the typical hoplitic panoply in general, doesn't equate by itself at all automatically to mean to fight in the ancient classical fight. They didn't work like that, and it's likely the more actually that was an exception in Greece herself, right? It was basically just Athens and Sparta that fought like that. If you go in places like Aetolia or Boiotia, you could find much more missile troops, cavalry, and therefore even on the Hellenic or Hellenized coasts of Western Asia Minor, you could find definitely, yes, this essentially heavily Hellenized or completely Hellenic communities, but not fighting in the way it happened, in fact, in the motherland. And this is true for even the Hellenic cities in southern Italy or Sicily or the Bosphorus or southern Gaul, right? Every time that model was explored eventually didn't hold, right? Because the landscape was different, the peoples they had to fight against was different, and it was actually much more dynamic, kind of individual kind of style of fighting, right? That increases, especially with the dynamism of the tactical sophistication that has kicked in the Hellenic, at this point Hellenistic world, since the time at least of Alexander, but already before actually certain tactical specialties were overlooked by historiography, but were already there, right? We know of Peltasts since the time of Pericles, even before, right? That suggesting the fact that, of course, aside from the hoplite, there were many other tactical specialties. At this point, even the average infantry trooper is something that is in fact much more similar to think about the Tureophorus, right? It's much more similar conceptually to the average, not properly tribal warfare, but in terms of at least of equipment, that they have this round shield that is mutilated either from the Celts or even the Italics. At some point, they're essentially skirmishers, but they can't fight also in close order. So they're a bit like the average of every kind of trooper that exists outside of the Greek world. That up to this point, with the politic phalanxes, had been an exception, because literally the entire rest of the sedentary world fought like with that. A shield, 2 or 3 javelins / spears, and a sword, and some, very light kind of armor, and that was it. That was standard, and it's not much about what kind of formation they employ, how they stay in ranks. The important is not that they fight, and they fight their own way. That is not necessarily a big deal. Actually, the politic warfare is actually not a big deal, and the fact that it remained confined, in fact, to the Hellenic motherland in its pure form, actually suggests that outside didn't work at all, because the rest of the other peoples were in many ways much more warlike and much more dynamic, and had a completely different way to which the Greeks had to adapt. We still have to make a kind of a didactic video in explaining these things in depth, but here and there I try to make a synthesis about it, because it's easy to get tricked by saying, I don't know, from this time on the Hellenistic world fought with phalanxes of pikemen. No, right? As we were saying before, you have no idea how just for building a sarissa, like for making it up, for constructing it, how many resources, how much did it take, the sheer amount of resources and time and energies to build one thing. Only major powers could afford the money to fight like that, and the others simply did without, right? And even striking victories after all on this system. So there is no, progressive evolution of warfare in this sense of tactics of warfare. It's much more important what the degree of cohesion of your political or social cohesion, your people, whichever it is that how you fight tactically on the field, right? What kind of tactical tradition you have. I give you, aside from the fact that of course every army is different, right? It's never been, historically speaking, an army that has ever been the same, like copied or standardized, or was even the same army fought in the same campaign, the same in every engagement, right? So we should go past this wargamistic prejudices of the pre-confectioned standard pack of what an army is on the field. Even when we think about the most standardized powers like Rome, or even the same Diadochi phalanxes for that matter, but they weren't, right? And they experimented a lot of things, and actually Hellenism was based exactly on this concept. So the Pergamene actually did their best in this regard. What accounts we have of Pergamon battles suggest that the Attalid kings fought only with cavalry, Peltasts, and lighter infantry, right? So essentially a standard combination of what, in fact, we were saying before, even non-Diadochi armies were about. Cavalry, we can imagine it to be well kept, well trained, because even the police militias had, especially the local aristocracies, knew how to fight on horseback. Certainly not as well as professionally trained cavalry from the military colonies of the Attic kingdoms, or not even actually tribal cavalries, aside from maybe their collective cohesion that wasn't that great deal. But we know of extensive protection and elite cavalry of sort. Even think about the Manichae, is full armor in many ways. Then lots of other of lighter cavalries of all types, mostly of skirmishing type. Then Peltasts, so skirmishers mostly, and even in here the terminology varies a lot. Like lighter infantry could have been Turiophoroi, but even in here you don't have to be surprised actually because we never have the certainty technically that what is what here. Like you find Peltasti in a Hellenistic source of the 2nd century BC. Could be literally, it simply literally means in their minds that it was non-categorical, not encyclopedical, as we're obsessed today. Instead, in our culture, that simply said a guy with a pelta, right? It could be even melee troops, right? Not necessarily just skirmishers. We have an example of such a Pergamon army composition, for example, for the campaign and battle of Magnesia, right, with Rome, where the Attalids deployed 800 cavalry, 3,000 Peltasts, 500 Cretan archers, and 500 Trallianoi, that is skirmishers that were other tribal troops from these other populations scattered in the Hellenistic world. And the Peltasts, at least in this case, were generally lightly armed Peltasts of the traditional type, right, rather than the term being used sometimes even for heavier troops, as we have seen. And 100 of the cavalry and 1,000 Peltasts were Achaean allies, by the way. Right, this often happened. I mean, the Hellenistic, I think at this time of the leagues that appear. In fact, the Achaean League, these were normally mercenaries sometimes. In this specific case, more precisely, were veteran troops who had distinguished themselves under the leader Theophanes in skirmishes with the Seleucids before. So troops that had fought away from the actual power that had employed them, they may have been actually recruited within the Achaean leagues communities, but they fundamentally were mercenaries, and the rest of the troops of the Pergamon troops at Magnesia were entirely mercenaries proper. That is, at least troops that weren't related even in here precisely with Pergamon itself, but just recruited here and there, right? Also, we know of 1,000 cavalry and 6,000 infantry from the Attalids taking part in the Roman war with Macedon in 171 BC as well, right? So in this case, they also sent troops overseas, and which was technically just next door, but once again, you have to pay for these troops. There is a logistics behind that, there is pace behind it, and so on. And this seems to be the largest Pergamon force on record. Just think about just the sheer size, right? It's not an enormous much. The kingdom was never a major military power. Let's stress it clearly. The cavalry included 200 Galatians. A further 1,000 had been sent to Greece, but lost when their ships were captured by the Macedonians as well. So the Galatians, as you know, were these, we said before, this Celtic population that settled in the heartland of Asia Minor, and whom the surrounding powers had some problem with, but actually not excessively more much. There's this cliche that the Celts were against every other, kind of Hellenic expansion. They sold their services to everybody, for that matter, including to Pergamon, as we will see in a while. The infantry included, we're talking always about the Macedonian expedition 171 BC, at least 150 Cretan and Mysian skirmishers, and 300 Kirti, were brigand mountaineer troops, I think, from Armenia. Mysia is the same region of Pergamon instead. So you find all these lighter troops, and from Crete naturally, that gather around from the surroundings. And all the Pergamene force, except 2,000 infantry detached for a siege, fought in the Callinicus skirmish. And as this involved cavalry and light troops, it seems all the Pergamene infantry were lightly armed, many probably Peltasts, as at Magnesia. So these troops were also auxiliary in a fashion. You can, telling the truth, do a lot with these lighter troops. The reason why they spread so much in Hellenic and eventually Hellenistic warfare is simply that even the territories from which they come are kind of more rugged, more difficult. So all these Peltasts, think about in the Balkans from the Agrianoi or the Thracians. The same goes for the Asia Minor's interland, right? These are all troops that are quite effective in ambushing, skirmishing, on hilly grounds, in valleys and choke points, etc. And they do their work, especially here we see as, for example, around a siege. What you really need in a siege is a lot of infantry that can, enclose the enemy fortification, and of course there have to be kind of more substantial troops to parry sorties and even attempts to break the siege itself. But these troops are good enough, right? Always remember, in warfare, most of the time it's not the best that makes the best result, but it's the good enough. This explains a lot, as a matter of fact, even regarding, in a way, the end of the Macedonian pikemen phalanxes at the end of the day. They were some of freaking terrifying military machine, but they costed enormous much. They could be employed in peculiar situations, etc. So what is that is going to work? The positivistically intended ideal, or the practical, pragmatic, in fact, reality, that and this kind of troops were to be in fact spread easily among the Ptolemies, for example, that abandoned the Phalanx earlier than other Diadochi, or even after the Seleucids after the defeat against Rome, right? So this was a standard, and the Romans used these troops as well, right? And they weren't conceptually enormously different from at least the model of the legionnaire, at least of the Italic infantries that the Romans were framing under in fact, their disciplinarian standards. Of course, they were a very different thing, but conceptually, it's in fact not much of the, Rome was rising as a power, even, given this discipline, this order, this supplies, logistical support, very good equipment, and so on. So these troops are kind of more throwaway, right? And they're more easier to spare. But in many ways, they're a model of something that wasn't that far from the older. And as we were saying before, this was what the average of the world brought as a fighter. As we've seen, Cretans were common in Pergamon service. They served as early as 208 BC against Macedon. A treaty of about 183 BC between Pergamon and a number of Cretan towns probably regulated their recruitment, right? As you know, Crete was mostly famous in the ancient world for their archers, right? And as Rhodes was famous for slingers and so on. And even here, where Crete was not dramatically developed as a place, even here is this mountaineer troops, these shepherds that were trained with these weapons such as bows and slings and so on. They found employment in this richer powers that were just close overseas. And the Trallianoi, that we will talk a bit more in detail when talking about the Seleucid army, also crop up on garrison duty, right? The good enough we're talking about before is probably this, right? These are troops that you just have to keep for strategic reasons in one place. Doesn't matter that they're this great much on the field. The importance is that, for example, if this stronghold is besieged by someone, there is someone who's defending them, that you can arrive with the field army, right? And this is what warfare is fought. And naturally, these major campaigns, just with sieges and major field army, they're not very frequent in warfare. They cost an enormous lot, something incredible, can wipe out an entire generation of an economical growth. So that's once again why these troops are so common. Mesians, whether as mercenaries or subjects, were often used. By the end of the kingdom's independence, they appear as military settlers, perhaps having been inherited from the Seleucids in 189 BC. There is here a sort of a proto-military colony, as you understand. So probably possibly an attempt, as we have seen, as after the victory over the Seleucids, the Pergamon borders had enlarged, so maybe there was more possibility to extend this kind of bit more kind of semi-permanent military system. I don't know there is enough evidence to support this, but it's an option. Mesians are variously found fighting as javelin men, tureophoroi, and archers. So the once again the good enough that we're talking about before, the standard troops you find around. And in which capacity they served Pergamon is not really clear, right? We know 100 light javelin men from mentioned in 171 BC could possibly be Mesian themselves, right? And it's natural that these were subject communities that the Pergamon could control with a sensible degree of iron fist, but also with whom they could not exaggerate more than much, because they represented also the local labor force, the communities on the force of which the same Pergamon power rested in a way. So there is always this problem: how many military expenses can you impose on a population without making it rebelling, right? And also mentioned as settlers are the Mazdians, probably from Mazdia in Paphlagonia. It was also in the north east of Pergamon. And they may have started out as mercenaries, being given land after 189 BC as well, in the fashion we were guessing before. And for the Pergamon army, we don't know how mercenary forces were organized, right? It's not clear. The troops of one garrison formed this unit called the Strategia, right? Another is divided into 6 hegemonia, right? So these are names like units derived from names of commanders, like the Strategos and the Hegemon, that are more similar to the Hellenic city-states ranks than actually one of the professional officers of the Diadochi armies, right? The Strategos is the standard name for a military commander. The Hegemon is in fact literally of an hegemonic figure, usually the head of a local government appointed in this kind of democratic ideal that he's hegemonically put there, but he's not quite a tyrant or someone who can dynasticize power, so on. We know of three hegemoniae of Mesians, 2 of Greek mercenaries. So this applies also to troops that are properly not from the Attalid possessions. They're foreigners. And 1 even of Pergamon citizens, right? So this seems to have been a pretty standard definition, like for all troops, like pretty generalized. And this suggests there wasn't probably also much of a permanent military structure behind that, right? So that you could apply this to various units of different backgrounds. Seems that it was a pretty generic standard practical term was used, but without much of an organization behind. Perhaps every sizable garrison force was rated as a strategia rather than it being a unit of fixed size, right? And the strategia divided into hegemoniae, right? Which could perhaps be usually maybe 256 man unit of most Hellenistic infantry, right? And alternatively, hegemony occurs also in the Ptolemaic organization, though, and though the role of the unit there is not clear, Lyskid thought it might be an alternative name for the Ekatonperkia. But that's how hypothetical as it sounds. In 189 BC, Pergamon acquired the Seleucid elephant corpse, right, the survivors of the 54 at Magnesia, and the military settlements of Lydia and Phrygia, as we have already seen. This is fascinating because evidently the Romans that also had been using elephants mostly from their African allies, even in Macedon, etc. They don't care much, but were probably this Hellenistic taste, like the idea after all, after the Seleucids. The Seleucids were the Diadochi kingdom that, for obvious reasons, been closer to India, and receiving, in fact, lots of elephants as diplomatic gifts, because the Maurya had an endless number of them, were a bit the symbol of this kind of exotic power, like of the Indian dream of Alexander, and this, big thing. Think about also Pyrrhus and the military tradition of the elephant. It was something important in the Hellenistic world. Since elephants rarely breed in captivity, the youngest will have been among those brought back from the east by Antiochus III himself just before 200 BC, and others may have been in Seleucid service longer and therefore been older, and a few will have lived after 150 BC. Pergamon had no access to more, so this was just an ephemeral presence in the Pergamon military after all. The military, however, became a regular part of the army. Right? Late Attalid kings, in fact, increased this element by founding military colonies on their own, probably settling mercenaries such as the Mazdaeans, as we have seen before. And that there might have been a reason here that, as we were saying before, doesn't maybe have much to do with properly military development as such. But possibly also in a general pacification of the area, like, with Rome became hegemonic in the Mediterranean. It's not that Pergamon had much to fear now. These troops were settled maybe to form the bulk of a new, a new militia could be called, summoned, with some land base and even some degree of professionalism of some sort, but there weren't major wars, major engagements, major threats at that point. We know that Pergamon didn't do much after this, so there may have been a crisis in the employment of mercenaries. Like the mercenary market, objectively, at the beginning of the 3rd century BC was way more dynamic than by the end of the 2nd century BC, right? At least as we can understand, but especially for the practical purposes of a power like Pergamon, right? So I don't see in those further developments anything comparable with the rest of the Diadochi powers that, however, were having troubles on their own. Actually, in the other sense, like their military colony systems had crumbled in a way, like this. Even the combativity of these communities had decreased. In parallel with the sedentarization, with the more difficult control that the central power could have on them, the outskirts of the empire. So it's the whole situation that internationally is going towards the rise of Rome and a bit of a general pacification of the area. Despite their reputation as the bulwark of Greek Asia against the Galatians, the Pergamon kings hired many Galatian troops, right? They fought against them, and naturally they hired a lot of them. That the Galatians were divided in different tribes. They weren't actually much of a threat in the first place, right? The quality of these troops doesn't seem to have been particularly high or lower. I don't know why the Galatians pass as some of the toughest scales around, but it doesn't seem to be the case, unless you take, how they, during the migration, how they came to Macedonia, how they sacked some areas, etc. But, doesn't seem to have been much of a big deal. There is perhaps even evidence that they lost part of their original warlikeness. Like, probably the toughest scales of of all were surely among the Belgians, the Albatians, and probably some very underrated tribes of the Danubian area that from which the same Galatians actually had come from, but they, or at least they had taken with them. But to draw dramatic standards of quality between troops of this area, so called as the Celtic world, is kind of nonsensical. The Galatian cavalry in 171 BC is mentioned, right, to send by the Italians to Macedonia. About 218 BC, Attalus the First hired a whole Gallic tribe from Europe instead, the Aigosagi, so-called, and they proved a nuisance because their wagon loads of families and possessions encumbered them on the march. And they were very, very superstitious, right? They refused to advance after an eclipse of the moon, which they took as a bad omen, and Attalus basically dismissed them, And this is also the reality of the Celtic migrations that weren't much of anything, due to, glory and, expansion. We're simply trying to find another place to live in this, what was probably a nightmarish experience in Central Europe, and finding this better lands in the south. Between 183 and 179 BC, Pergamon fought in alliance with Cappadocia against Pharnaces of Pontus. Right. Cappadocia being this continental region, Pontus being properly in the north, in Central Asia Minor, and they naturally the Pergamon was bothered by the Pontic expansion at some point. And it was even halted. In fact, they had various different outcomes. Even the Galatians actually stopped the Pontics at some point. And in 155-54 BC, Attalus II was joined by infantry and cavalry sent by both Ariartes of Cappadocia and Mithridates of Pontus under a Cappadocian prince for a war this time against Prusias II of Bithynia. It's interesting because the Pontic area, Cappadocia, etc., were they were also somewhat multi-ethnic. You have to imagine these areas we were saying before, having first been under the Achaemenid Empire, then having been under the Alexandrian Empire, were all a lot of these different influences also from the Pontic, properly the Black Sea area and so on. So were very dynamic cultures. Cappadocia had very good cavalry. Pontus as well. They had this more Oriental tradition compared to this, in fact, more Hellenic powers of Western Asia Minor. And it's interesting that they were sent presumably as we see here cavalry and infantry alike. Once again, Pergamon was revealed as a military weak power in the occasion of the war against the Bithynians, unable to make an headway against its enemies until the allies arrived. And objectively, logistically speaking, I don't think it's that easy to launch an offensive against a power of that size in comparison and over this distance. So this reveals in many ways also why Pergamon didn't expand on its own more than much. Finally, Pergamon had a fine arsenal and an excellent store of artillery, right? Providing catapults to Rome for a joint siege they fought in 200 BC and eventually keeping to produce some. Pergamon, as you know, was one of the greatest centers of Hellenistic technology, literature, art. It would remain so, as a matter of fact, for a long time, and therefore, similarly to Rhodes or the Alexander, the Corinth, these centers, they had quite important poliorcetic capabilities, technologies at least. And these were also a legacy of the Adoci. That were essentially the Macedonians that had originally pioneered tension, siege, and engines. And these local powers simply inherited the technologies, implemented them, and they would be important for Rome also to get acquainted. At this time, 200 BC, Rome had finally been opened fully to the major arsenals, especially most of them they would find in Carthago Nova, and eventually in 146 BC in Carthage also an enormous amount of catapults of any size, and here Rome is expanding to the properly Hellenistic world and finding all of these, the best of these engineers that were military engineers serving also in the Roman armies, right? As we've seen, the Pergamens being Roman allies against other Hellenistic powers also used catapults and so on. There is evidence towards these years, for example, the Battle of the Thermopylae between the Romans and the Seleucids. The Seleucids tried to barrage the Roman crossing of the Thermopylae Pass even with catapults, aside from with the phalanges. But these technological solutions wouldn't have, by themselves are always inferior to a synergic interaction of arms, that is always surpassing them. So technology alone is never the answer, especially the siege were properly siege engines, right? They were mostly used in siege warfare. In fact, the Thermopylae example is kind of an exception in that regard, and that's mostly where you want to use them. But by the way, they're extremely costly. You can't build them like everywhere. You need specific material. This engineering competencies that up to that point the Romans hadn't quite cultivated on their own. At least they were acquainted to them. They surely did. Rome had her own its own Greek community since a long time. But another thing is to get acquainted with allies and enemies that can provide you with some of practically and mostly well experienced personnel that knows how to employ and has already employed them in actual warfare, which is really what makes the difference on the field. Alright, and this is basically all for this video. It's a bit short, maybe for the topic, but as you know, this is just the military organization, right? For these Hellenistic powers, at some point we will deal with tactics a bit in the aside from the single battles videos, but like all together, because objectively, yeah, as we have seen, that there was something in common with all these powers. Some made exception, like Pergamon didn't have properly pikemen phalanx, but for that matter, those who had fought essentially in the same way. Also, we will probably look at in other videos as some Pergamene units, but I presume that there isn't much of a typological approach you can make. Anyhow, we will widen the thing by talking about other Hellenistic powers that more or less, as we've seen, use the same units, and that's ultimately what matters, right? Not being too dogmatic or typological, categorical, or wargamistic about these differences. Anyhow, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.